As Fred mentioned, our next speaker is our United States Senator, Pat Toomey. And in preparing to introduce Pat, I looked at his bio and I thought, you know, there's really not a need for me to tell you who he is, because his candidacy for the United States Senate in many ways was born right here at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. And as Fred mentioned, it was his first campaign for the United States Senate that rejuvenated this conference. So rather than tell you who he is, since you all know him, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it is that he's been able to accomplish. And if you go back just a couple of weeks ago, President Obama had nominated for a position as Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department Civil Rights Museum an individual who had become belatedly part of the defense team for Mumia Abu-Jamal, who, as we all know, is a convicted cop killer from Philadelphia. Senator Toomey thought it was wrong that this individual should serve in the United States Department of Justice. He not only convinced every one of his Republican colleagues, he convinced his Democratic colleague here in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, and 6 other Democratic senators to join him in blocking a nomination to the Justice Department by President Obama, a virtually unheard of feat in recent years in Harrisburg. He was part of a group of people who worked to ban earmarks in the United States Senate. He has worked for reforms of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in order to clamp down on subsidies to Russia, and particularly in the Ukraine. He has introduced a number of balanced budgets and balanced budget resolutions, and he has also worked to kill continued expenditures of the TARP fund. And if you add all of this up, what you get is an ACU conservative rating in this past session of 80%. His Club for Growth rating is 93%. And if you add together his time in the United States Senate and his 2 terms in the Congress, 2 terms or 3 terms? 3 terms. 3 terms in Congress, his lifetime rating is an astounding 95%. You add all of that together, and what you get is the most conservative United States Senator in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and, might I point out, a conservative senator in what is a blue state. This is a senator who has proven that you can both have your principles and also get things done in Washington. Let's give a warm Pennsylvania Leadership Conference welcome to United States Senator Pat Toomey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that very warm welcome. Lohman, I appreciate that very kind introduction. I appreciate your leadership here. This is, once again, shaping up to be a terrific conference, and Lohman deserves so much of the credit for that. But a lot of credit also goes to arguably Pennsylvanians' father of the conservative movement, maybe the grandfather of the conservative movement, Fred Anton. And Fred, thank you so much for all your leadership, for all that you've done. I've been doing this lunch event, this kickoff event, Lohman, for some time, and it's always a pleasure to be back. By the way, is my mic working okay? No, I'm not asking you. I'm asking the people at the NSA. I want to make sure they hear every word I say. But I really just enjoy the energy and the enthusiasm, and seeing the the outpouring of support, the organizational ability, this movement of people who believe in the great tradition of this great republic. The conservative movement has matured so much; it continues to grow in influence. I am not aware of the lefties having a comparable type of gathering, and that's a good thing. So congratulations, and thank you all so much for your participation. This event is always an inspiration for me, and when you serve in a Democratic-controlled Senate, you need all the inspiration you can get. Lohman alluded to a really important moment on the Senate floor recently, and I want to tell you a little bit about the details, because it was a rare and I think a big conservative victory, but more than a conservative victory, it was a victory for America when we were able to deny the confirmation of a really poor choice to run the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department when we denied Debo Adegbela the confirmation. I want to tell you that story about how that happened, and then I'm going to make two other quick stories that will seem unrelated, and I'm going to try to tell you why I think there's a common element to this. I'll try to tie it all up towards the end. But I want to start with the story of this confirmation battle, and it really begins a long time ago. This story begins at 3:51 a.m. on December 9th in 1981. A 25-year-old Philadelphia police officer, Daniel Faulkner, pulled over a car in downtown Philadelphia. Its headlights were off and it was driving the wrong way on a one-way street. The driver got out of the car and immediately began to assault Officer Faulkner. The driver's brother, Mumia Abu-Jamal, was across the street. He was watching. 4 eyewitnesses saw him race across the street, shoot Daniel Faulkner in the back, and while Faulkner was lying wounded, helpless, unarmed, on his back, Abu-Jamal pumped 4 more bullets into him, including one in his face, and killed him. 3 other witnesses heard Abu-Jamal brag that he had shot Daniel Faulkner and that he hoped he would die. During the trial, when Danny Faulkner's blood-stained shirt was displayed, the jury saw Abu-Jamal turn in his chair and smirk at the widow of Officer Faulkner. So it was no big surprise, given the combination of eyewitnesses and forensic evidence, that a Pennsylvania jury took only 3 hours to convict Abu-Jamal of murder. I might point out a multiracial jury. Took 2 hours to sentence him to death. Then, instead of allowing Danny Faulkner's young widow to grieve in peace, a group of political opportunists decided that they would use this case to further their own political agenda. They fabricated claims of racism. They spread lies about the trial and the evidence. They started organizing rallies that amazingly started to portray Mumia Abu-Jamal as the victim. Before long, Abu-Jamal was a cause célèbre, complete with the predictable adoring Hollywood celebrities, free Mumia t-shirts and posters on college campus. You may remember some of these. He had his own HBO special. Even had a street named after him in Paris, France. Now, this was an international campaign. It was based on hatred of America. It was based on contempt for our criminal justice system, and the goal was to indict the United States of America as a hopelessly racist country with a racist criminal justice system for which the solution was to release an unrepentant cop killer. In 2009, 27 years after Danny Faulkner's murder, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or LDF, decided to join in the fray. Now, Debo Adegbela was the director of litigation at the NAACP's LDF at the time. They all reported to him. He supervised the entire staff, 18 lawyers, a lot of resources. And he was leading those lawyers as they piled on to this outrageous, ridiculous, and offensive case. In February 2011, Mr. Adegbela's group issued a press release. They said, and I quote, "Mumia Abu-Jamal's conviction and death sentence are relics of a time and place that was notorious for police abuse and racial discrimination." In May of 2011, 2 of the lawyers supervised by Mr. Adegbela traveled to France for a rally on behalf of Mumia Abu-Jamal. One of those lawyers said she was, quote, overjoyed that Abu-Jamal's death sentence was suspended, but she bemoaned the fact that he was still serving in prison and wouldn't be set free. Another LDF lawyer described Abu-Jamal as one of the, quote, people who are innocent, but will, quote, will continue to be put to death in America. At another event in New York that same year, another lawyer working for Adegbela gushed, "It is absolutely my honor to represent Mumia Abu-Jamal." She continued by saying, quote, "There's no question in my mind, there's no question in the mind of anyone at the Legal Defense Fund that the justice system has completely and utterly failed Mumia Abu-Jamal, and that failure has everything to do with race." Well, folks, I got to tell you, I agree that the justice system had failed, but it failed Danny Faulkner and Danny Faulkner's family. So imagine my shock. Imagine Danny Faulkner's family's shock when President Obama decided to nominate Dibu Adigbella to be the Assistant Attorney General responsible for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department. Folks, I just could not let that stand, not without a fight. Now, I knew the odds of defeating a presidential nominee's confirmation on the Senate floor were not good. Presidents usually get their nominees confirmed. And after all, the Democrats control the Senate. Last fall, as you know, they changed the rules so that they could confirm presidential nominees with a simple majority. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Going into this fight, I knew it would not be enough to hold all the Republicans, which would be a tall order in the first place. But we'd need all the Republicans and at least 6 Democrats to prevent this man from becoming America's top civil rights law enforcer. But you know, sometimes you have to wage the battle even if the odds don't look good. And sometimes, when you stand on principle, you can overcome the odds. So I went to work writing op-eds, did floor speeches, radio interviews, TV interviews, press conferences, several press conferences with the Philadelphia FOP, who were very supportive of this, and untold conversations with my Senate colleagues. On the morning of the vote, I went down to the Senate floor. I was preparing my final comments that I would make on this matter. And I didn't know if we had the votes to defeat this nominee. I was worried we didn't. But as I was finishing up my notes, I looked up and a door swung open on the Senate floor, and in walked the Vice President. I was never so happy to see the Vice President of the United States because it told me as he approached the chair to sit in the chair that they knew that they may not have the votes and they may need him to break a tie. They called a vote, and in fact, we held every single Republican to vote against confirming this nominee. And we picked up 6 Democrats, and we defeated the nomination of Dibu Adigbella. Now, I want to be very clear about something because I think it's important and because my opponents in this debate falsely accuse me of several things that need to be addressed. The first is, this was not about the principle that every defendant deserves a competent defense. Of course every defendant deserves a competent defense. That's not what this was about. This was not about condemning a lawyer for the crimes of his client. I think that would be a mistake in our system. It's inappropriate. Dibu Adigbella's offense was neither of those two things. It was that he chose to join a campaign, a political campaign. I'll tell you what this was about. This is about a principle that if you decide to make a mockery of our criminal justice system, if you decide to fan the flames of racial strife in America, if you decide to make a mockery of America itself, and if along the way you're willing to drag the family of a fallen police officer through 3 decades of hell, if you want to do that, this is a free country, you should be free to do it. But don't expect to be confirmed to run the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department by the United States Senate. Now, totally separate story. Just last week, you may have seen, and you may not have because it hasn't gotten... See, I thought you guys were going to let me speak. A new decision, a proposed rule, is to be more precise, coming from the EPA, is the latest and one of the most dramatic attempts at a power grab that I have seen coming out of this administration, and that is saying something. This rule that they are proposing would redefine their jurisdiction. Do you think it narrows their jurisdiction? No. It would dramatically expand their jurisdiction. It would expand their power to regulate, frankly, all of us. I'll explain this briefly. Existing law makes it very clear that the EPA's jurisdiction is limited to navigable waterways. The word navigable appears in the legislation that authorizes their regulatory power repeatedly. Now, I understand that the exact meaning of navigable is debated, and there's some controversy about that. And I will tell you, I am not a lawyer, but I am reasonably proficient in the English language. Navigable has to have a meaning. So, am I going way out on a limb to suggest that in order for a body of water to qualify as navigable, maybe it ought to be able to float a canoe? Is that reasonable? maybe a rowboat. Well, that is not the standard that is being considered. What the EPA wants to do is to have the power to, frankly, the water that drips off your car if you wash it and lands on your driveway, by the logical formulation of the EPA, could very well come under their regulation, which is to say essentially all outdoor water. It's breathtaking in its scope. It is well beyond the intent of Congress and the legislation that authorizes this. We are not talking about rivers and streams or even brooks. We're not talking about just farmland and woodlands. We're talking about your front yard. There's no law that permits this. And yet, they seem to be proceeding to do it. Item number 3 that I want to mention is something I know you're familiar with. It is the ongoing, breathtaking, almost daily, it seems, presidential rewriting of Obamacare. This, of course, is completely without any legal authority. The president has already unilaterally changed this law literally dozens of times. Apparently, the written law doesn't matter very much to him. I'll give you an example. There's a very clear feature in this bill that says that the federal subsidies are available to people who get their insurance through state-sponsored exchanges. There's a reason why they designed it that way. That was a very conscious decision. But when it turned out that a lot of states chose not to do an exchange, the president simply unilaterally changes that policy and says the subsidies will go to anyone who gets their insurance on either a state or a federal exchange. There's absolutely no legal basis for this. The law is very clear. Again, it doesn't seem to matter to this administration. And let's be clear, what most of the changes are about. What most of the changes are about are delaying the most painful effects of this terrible legislation until after the midterm elections. That's what's really going on here. So what's the link here between the nomination of Deebu Adigbella, the EPA's regulatory overreach, and the president's serial rewriting of Obamacare? I would suggest that these are all examples of an administration that is now out of control. It is frequently exceeding legal authority, it's violating constitutional principles, and what's particularly troubling from where I sit is it's doing so with the complicity and the cooperation of the Democrat-controlled Senate. Now, let me be clear, the nomination of Deebu Adigbella was not a violation of any law. That was a violation of good judgment, but not of the law. But it was also the inevitable consequence of the radical steps that Senator Reid and the President have taken in order that they may be better able to pass an agenda through regulation that they cannot achieve through legislation. Let me explain what I mean by this. We all probably remember the President's State of the Union address when he famously stood there and threatened, "I've got a pen and a phone, and I'm not going to wait on Congress." You remember that, right? Ladies and gentlemen, this was no idle threat. He meant it. And it was a description of what he's been doing, and it's a description of what he intends to do. This is why last fall, this threat to pursue this regulatory agenda, even when it is contrary to legislation, this is why last fall the President aggressively supported and Harry Reid agreed to change the rules of the Senate, to break the rules of the Senate so that they could change the rules to suit their purpose. This was done principally so that they could change the composition of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Now this, I haven't connected the dots very well here, so let me try to do that. You see, the recourse the American people have when an executive imposes regulations without statutory authority to do it, which this president has been doing frequently, the recourse is the courts. You can go to court and you can have your case heard. And people do that and have done that, and they will continue to do that. And as these cases get appealed, do you know who the final adjudication is? It's the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Well, Senator Reid and Senator Schumer told us what they think of all this. They were not happy with the decisions coming out of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, decision that was reining in the administration on the NLRB, reining them in on the EPA and other matters. So they made it very clear. They said, if we don't get the decisions we want out of this court, we're going to change the court. And we're going to do it one way or another. This should be chilling. So last fall, they came to us. At the moment when this change went into effect, there had been 1,411 presidential nominees subject to a confirmation vote on the Senate floor. 1,411. The Senate had confirmed 1,407. My argument to my Republican colleagues is we have not sufficiently exercised our responsibility to withhold consent when we think it should be withheld. But that's the reality. The president had gotten 99.8% of his nominees confirmed when Senator Reid approached us and said, now we want these 3 judges to be put on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals so that they could change its composition. At that point, Republican senators said, sorry, we can't help you with that. When you confess that your purpose is to politicize this court, when you publicly declare that your goal is to turn what should be an independent branch, the judiciary of the United States, into an extension of the political apparatus of the White House, when you tell us that that is your mission, we're really not going to help you achieve that. And they said, fine, then we'll do it without you. And so they changed the rules so that for the first time in the history of the Republic, a simple majority can confirm any nominee that the president sends them. And that's where we are today. So how does this relate to some of the recent nominees? Well, as you might imagine, every previous president has had to concern himself that any nominee would have some level of bipartisan support, and that has a tendency to have a moderating influence. That's gone. The president knows that he doesn't need a single Republican vote to confirm any of his nominees, and so that has already predictably moved him to the extremes of some of the people that he's chosen. Debo Adegbela being an example. Another example is this Dr. Vivek Murthy, who he proposed for Surgeon General. This is a guy who wants to ban whole categories of guns. He supports mandatory waiting periods. He thinks that guns are a health care issue, and this guy's going to be the Surgeon General? I don't think so. Thankfully, it looks like we've defeated both of those. But this all points to a bigger issue before us as a nation. As a society, we've got a constitutional challenge. We have a case in which, because of the current leadership, the Senate is being surrendered to the administration. Now, I'd have never met anyone who has more respect for our founding fathers than I do. But I honestly don't think they ever imagined that a Senate leader would intentionally subordinate the Senate to the executive branch. But that's what's happening. It's an unprecedented abdication of responsibility. Responsibility to provide checks and balances. The responsibility to hold the executive accountable. A responsibility to make sure that we keep an independent judiciary. So I'm fighting this every way that I can, but given that we're in the minority in the Senate, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. And I think you may be able to see why I think this upcoming election is just incredibly important. It's for the sake of our Constitution, for the sake of the Republic. We have to make Senator Harry Reid the Senate Minority Leader. And the good news is we've got a real chance to do it. I think we have a better than even chance of doing that, and I'm going to work as hard as I can to make sure that that happens. And I know that if we get there, look, things are still going to be difficult. We're still going to have divided government. President Obama will still be in the White House. We conservatives won't always get our way. Sometimes we won't have the votes we need in the Senate, but sometimes we will. And yes, the president will still have a veto pen, but he can't veto everything. And if we could defeat an ill-chosen nominee of the president's while in the minority, surely we can have some important victories in the majority. I think we can. I think we could stop the advance of this out-of-control regulatory state. I mean, with control of both houses of Congress, we would actually control the purse strings and be able to withhold funding from some of these regulators who are out of control. We'd be able to roll back some of the regulatory madness that's already happened by just forcing votes on the things that the Democrats are hiding from. I'll tell you what, if we're in the majority, we're going to send the president a bill that is going to authorize and require the construction of the Keystone Pipeline. We're going to do it. And if the president vetoes it, we'll override the veto. The support is there. If we're in the majority, we're going to repeal the medical device tax, and we're going to send that to the president with enough backing to override a veto should he veto that. But we need to control the chamber in order to have the vote. You wouldn't believe the lengths to which the Democrats went just yesterday in the Finance Committee on which I sit to prevent a vote on that common sense reform. And I will say this, yes, even with Barack Obama in the White House, we will be able to begin chipping away at that monstrosity that is Obamacare. And by the way, I've been hearing a lot lately from people who are suggesting, you know, you guys need to get over this, okay? Just get used to it. It's been the law of the land for 4 years. It's taken effect. People are getting their subsidies. Nothing you can do about it. You're just going to have to accept it. To which I say, nonsense. That is ridiculous. The fact is, we need to completely repeal that legislation as soon as we can. We need to replace it with a totally different direction on health care. We're not going to continue to be so heavily burdened by that legislation. We need an alternative model in healthcare that puts patients at the center, not bureaucrats, that restructures our payment system so that it rewards value instead of volume, and most fundamentally, that just restores freedom and gets away from government edicts, as we must throughout our entire government. Folks, there is so much work to do. There are so many opportunities. This is our moment to restore our freedom, to take our country back. I know we can do it. I'm confident we will do it. And if you have any doubts, then I would just remind you of the wisdom of the great Winston Churchill, who said about all of us, he said, you know, you can always count on the Americans to get it right after they've exhausted every other possible option. Folks, we've been exhausting the other options these last 5 years. It's time to start getting it right. Thank you very much for all your support. Thank you for all that you do.